Imagine you're 65 years old. Retirement has finally arrived. No alarm clock. No boss. No Monday morning meetings. You walk into your kitchen, pour yourself a cup of coffee, sit down at the table, and open your retirement account. The number staring back at you is $500,000. $500,000. Let me ask you something. Would you retire tomorrow? Most people would. In fact, you may already be saying yes. But what if that's the wrong answer? And what if the biggest retirement mistake isn't running out of money? What if it's something far more painful? Here's the shocking part. Some retirees with $500,000 sleep peacefully every night. Others with twice as much live in constant fear. Why? And what if the answer has nothing to do with money? Before you decide whether $500,000 is enough, there's one question almost nobody asks. And the answer to that question could completely change the way you think about retirement. Most people ask, is $500,000 enough? It sounds like the right question. It's the question financial websites ask. It's the question retirement calculators ask. It's the question friends ask. But unfortunately, that's where most retirees get it wrong. Because $500,000 isn't the answer. It's just a number. The real question is, enough for what? A simple retirement? A travel-focused retirement? A retirement where you help your children and grandchildren? A retirement where you spend winters in Florida and summers near family? Let me ask you something. Can two people retire with exactly the same amount of money and end up with completely different lives? The answer is yes. And that's where most retirement plans already fail. Imagine retiree A and retiree B. Both are 65 years old. Both have exactly $500,000 saved. Retiree A owns a paid-off home, enjoys a simple lifestyle, and receives Social Security. Retiree B still has debt, wants to travel constantly, and spends significantly more each month. Same savings. Completely different retirement. So when someone asks, is $500,000 enough? The honest answer is that nobody can answer that question until they understand the life you're trying to build. But that's only half the story. Because the next problem is something nobody controls. What if your retirement doesn't start when you planned? Most people imagine retirement like a finish line. They pick an age. Maybe 65. Maybe 67. Maybe 70. They create a plan. They imagine they'll work a few more years, save a little more money, and then retire comfortably. But life doesn't always follow the plan. What if health gets in the way? What if your company downsizes? What if you suddenly need to care for a spouse or family member? What if retirement starts 5 years earlier than expected? Here's the shocking part. For many people, retirement isn't a choice. It's an event. And when retirement arrives unexpectedly, everything changes. Think about that for a moment. Imagine spending years telling yourself, I'll save more next year. Then suddenly next year never comes. Imagine planning to work until age 70, but leaving at 64 because of circumstances you never saw coming. Most retirees never see this coming. And that's when the clock starts ticking. Not because you're running out of money. Because you're running out of time. And that leads us to a much bigger question. A question that very few people are prepared to answer. What if your retirement lasts longer than your career? Think about that. Most people work for 30 or 40 years. But what if retirement lasts 30 years too? What if you retire at 65 and live to 95? Would $500,000 still feel like a lot of money? Maybe. Maybe not. And that's exactly why millions of retirees become afraid to spend. But here's where things get interesting. The fear isn't always caused by reality. Sometimes it's caused by uncertainty. And what researchers discovered next surprised a lot of people. Because many retirees aren't running out of money at all. In fact, some are doing the exact opposite. And that's where everything changes. And that's where everything changes. Because most people assume retirees are afraid of one thing, not having enough money. But what if I told you that many retirees who are financially secure still spend years worrying about money? Let me ask you something. If you knew with absolute certainty that you would never run out of money, what would you do differently tomorrow? Would you finally take that dream trip? Spend more time with family? Help your grandchildren? Take the cruise you've been postponing for years? Most people immediately know the answer. So here's the real question. If retirees want those things so badly, why don't they do them? The answer sounds simple, but it changes everything. Fear. Not fear of losing money. Fear of needing money later. And according to recent retirement studies, this fear is becoming one of the most powerful forces shaping retirement decisions. In fact, a 2026 retirement study found that 67% of Americans worry more about running out of money than death itself. Think about that for a second. More people fear running out of money than dying. But that's not the real question. The real question is this: what if the fear itself is creating the problem? Imagine a retiree named John. John has a paid-off house. He receives Social Security. He has $500,000 saved. His expenses are manageable. On paper, he's doing fine. But every time he thinks about spending money, a voice in his head asks the same question. What if I need this later? So John delays the trip. Delays the experience. Delays the enjoyment. Delays the life he spent 40 years preparing for. And that's where things get interesting. Because John isn't alone. Recent reports show that many retirees are actually reaching age 90 with the same amount of money, or even more money, than they had when they first retired. Not because they were wealthy. Not because they never spent anything. But because they became so afraid of spending that their portfolios continued growing while their dreams stayed on hold. One recent study found that about 60% of retirees had more savings later in retirement than when they initially retired. Think about how shocking that is. Most workers spend their entire careers worrying they'll run out of money. But what if the bigger risk is never allowing yourself to use it? What if you're solving the wrong problem? And that's where retirement becomes psychological instead of financial. Because money is no longer the challenge. Permission is. Permission to spend. Permission to travel. Permission to enjoy. Permission to stop treating every dollar as an emergency reserve. But unfortunately, that's where most retirees get it wrong. They keep waiting. Waiting for more certainty. Waiting for a bigger account balance. Waiting for the perfect moment. And the perfect moment never arrives. Which brings us to one of the strangest discoveries in retirement. What if the biggest retirement risk isn't spending too much? Pause. What if it's never spending enough? At first, that sounds ridiculous. How could spending too little be a risk? But think about it. Imagine someone spends 40 years saving for retirement. They sacrifice. They budget. They delay gratification. They work overtime. They reach retirement. Then they continue living exactly as if they're still saving for retirement. What's the point? What are you actually saving for? Money? Or freedom? Money? Or experiences? Money? Or family memories? Most retirees never ask this question. And that's why many of them end up trapped in what experts call the retirement spending paradox. They finally have the resources they spent decades building, yet they're emotionally unable to use them. Recent retirement research shows that confident retirees tend to focus less on protecting every dollar and more on aligning their spending with what truly matters to them. But the story doesn't end there. Because reality eventually shows up. And when it does, it often arrives in a way nobody expects. Let me ask you something. How many healthy years do you think you have left? And are you absolutely sure? Because the next part of this story begins with a phone call. A phone call that can change everything. Because the next part of this story begins with a phone call. A phone call that can change everything. Let me ask you something. How many healthy years do you think you have left? 10? 15? 20? Maybe more? Now let me ask you a harder question. Are you absolutely sure? Most people never ask themselves that question. Because nobody likes thinking about it. Nobody likes imagining the unexpected. But retirement has a way of reminding us that life doesn't always follow the plan. Imagine a retiree who spent years worrying about investment returns. Years worrying about inflation. Years worrying about market crashes. Then one day the phone rings. A doctor's office. A test result. A diagnosis. And suddenly the entire retirement plan changes. Not because the money disappeared. Because priorities changed. And that's when everything changed. What happened next surprised researchers. Many retirees report that their biggest regrets weren't investment mistakes. They weren't stock market mistakes. They weren't withdrawal mistakes. Their biggest regrets involved time. Time they thought they had. Time they assumed would always be available. Time that disappeared faster than expected. And that leads us to a question almost nobody wants to answer. What if your best retirement years are happening right now? Think about that. Age 65. Energy. Mobility. Freedom. Possibility. Now imagine age 85. Maybe the money is still there. Maybe the investments survived. Maybe the retirement account actually grew. But the body changed. The energy changed. The opportunities changed. Which would you rather have? More money? Or more healthy years? The answer sounds obvious, but most people live as if the opposite is true. They treat money as if it's the limited resource. When in reality, time is often the resource quietly disappearing in the background. What if time is actually your most valuable asset? What if the clock matters more than the account balance? And what if retirement isn't a money problem at all? Most retirees never see this coming. Because all their attention stays focused on the number. The portfolio. The account balance. The next statement. The next market update. But the story doesn't end there. Because researchers noticed something fascinating. The happiest retirees often don't have the biggest portfolios. They don't necessarily have the largest houses. They don't always have the highest net worth. So what do they have? Purpose. Meaning. Relationships. Experiences. A reason to get out of bed. Let me ask you something. What are you actually saving for? Money? Or freedom? Money? Or experiences? Money? Or family? Money? Or memories? If you had enough, would you know it? That's a question most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Because chasing a bigger number feels safer than defining what enough actually means. Unfortunately, that's where most retirees get it wrong. They spend decades building the retirement account, but very little time building the retirement life. And that's when the final lesson becomes clear. Remember the question we started with? Is $500,000 enough? Wrong question. It was always the wrong question. The real question is this. Can you recognize enough when you finally have it? Because some people retire with $1 million and still feel afraid. Others retire with less and feel completely secure. Why? Because confidence and money are not the same thing. Security and money are not the same thing. Purpose and money are not the same thing. And that's where this entire story comes together. Imagine reaching age 90. Your money lasted. Your investments survived. Your house is still yours. You solved every financial problem. Pause. There's one problem you can no longer solve. Time. You can't buy back the trip you never took. You can't buy back the summers you postponed. You can't buy back the experiences you delayed. You can't buy back the years you spent waiting for perfect certainty. And that's why the real question was never whether $500,000 was enough. The real question was whether you knew how to use the years you had left. Because the saddest retirement isn't running out of money. The saddest retirement is spending your whole life preparing to live. And never giving yourself permission to do it. So let me leave you with one final question. If you had exactly $500,000 today, would you retire tomorrow? Or are you still waiting for a number that may never feel safe? Let me know in the comments below.